Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you all back for this new calendar year. Wish you a happy new year and hope your holiday season was pleasant, relaxing, and joyful. Or if you were in a situation like mine where my in-laws came into town, I hope your return to work is pleasant and peaceful and relaxing. Okay, it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome back a friend and colleague of many years, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, as this afternoon's Grand Round Speaker. Stuart has a joint appointment as a professor in the departments of anesthesiology and psychology. He also serves as the the associate director of the Center of Consciousness, and he was one of the co-founders back in November of 1999. Additionally, he has organized several symposia titled Toward a Science of Consciousness, the Tucson Discussions and Debates, which have since, along with Al Kazniak of Psychology, been published in book form. He has additionally either authored or edited books on biomolecular consciousness and nanotechnology. These topics are additionally represented in numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals and also in book chapters. He is the organizer of the Quantum Mind 2003 Conference on Consciousness, Quantum Physics, and the Brain, to be held in March of this year. Is that going to be here on main campus?
Convention Center.
The Convention Center, okay. He was the leader of a prior internet course entitled Consciousness at the Millennium, Quantum Approaches to Understanding the Mind. He is the recipient of several grants from the Fetzer Institute, the National Science Foundation, and other groups to study consciousness. He also has attained celebrity status, having appeared in 2 BBC shows, a PBS show, the Discovery Channel, and in several documentary films. This afternoon, Dr. Hameroff's talk is entitled, How Does the Brain Produce Consciousness? Stuart?
Thank you very much, John. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to address you, a group of psychiatrists who deal with the mind directly and kind of fine-tune it. As an anesthesiologist, I take a more blunt approach, you might say. So me talking to you is kind of like a house painter talking to a group of artists, I think. My interest in consciousness preceded my choice of anesthesiology, actually, and I've been interested in it for a number of years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about it now. And I'm not going to start off by defining consciousness, although I think I will as I go along. There are many stories about conferences and talks where they set out to define it and wind up spending the entire time with a definition. So we'll just dispense with that, and I think you'll understand what I mean by consciousness, and of course, you know what you mean by consciousness. Anyway, David Chalmers is a philosopher here at the University of Arizona. He's probably the leading young philosopher of mind in the world. And he joined our Center for Consciousness group a few years ago and is a professor in philosophy. He's become famous for defining what he called the hard problem of consciousness, which is actually a restatement of an issue that goes back to the Greeks, but he did it very well and cleverly. Basically, first he starts off by the easy problems, which really are not so easy. The ability to discriminate, categorize, and react to environmental stimuli, the integration of information by a cognitive system, reportability of mental states, the ability of the system to access its own internal states, focusing attention, control of behavior, and the difference between wakefulness and sleep. And I might add, and the difference between wakefulness and anesthesia, which is different from sleep. If you're asleep and someone takes a knife to you, you're going to notice it. But under anesthesia, you wouldn't. Now, any of these, I think, aberrations of any of these easy problems would probably warrant a psych consult. And, but they're still relatively easy compared to the hard problem. The really hard problem, according to Dave and others, is that of subjective phenomenal experience. The smell of a rose, the sound of an oboe, the felt quality of emotion, and the experience of a stream of conscious thought. We have an inner life. We have something inside of us that gives us experience, and presumably robots and machines do not. As far as animals, that's another topic. I think they do, although it's certainly different. So this inner life. And philosophers describe this experience as being comprised of qualia. Qualia are sort of the raw components of conscious experience. It's kind of like a painter with a palette where the individual simple colors on the palette are the qualia, and he or she puts it together to give a complex painting. So our complex, rich experience is comprised of simple, fundamental qualia. So you may see that word. And philosophers have also come up with a probably hypothetical construct called a zombie, who is someone who may look and act like us but doesn't have any consciousness. And this is a useful philosophical tool. And Dave and I also developed the zombie blues, which is usually performed late night in the bars at consciousness conferences. Some of you may have heard it. Well, in addition to the easy problems, there's some other rather difficult problems. I mentioned the hard problem, number one. And there's also the binding problem. Why and how disparate brain processes are unified into single objects, a sense of unified self. If you look at an object, my finger, for example, there's different shape, color, meaning, and so forth. They're processed, presumably different parts of your brains, but it all comes together to tell you what it is. Similarly, there's only one of us, at least most of us have only one entity, conscious self inside of us, the so-called unitary self. Another problem is the transition from preconscious or subconscious processes to consciousness itself. The same brain regions may be subconscious at one moment and manifest consciousness at another, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second. Consciousness is really the tip of an iceberg. The problem of free will or non-computability, if we indeed have free will, I think we do. I don't have any choice but to believe that. And subjective flow of time in physics outside of consciousness, there really isn't an arrow of time. This is a very interesting problem. And I went to a conference about this in Europe, about the physics and geometry and psychology of time. And finally, the problem of non-locality spatially and temporally, if you believe in things like ESP and whatnot. And there are some interesting data about that. Well, the scientific study of consciousness sort of started a couple hundred years ago with phrenology, believe it or not. Francis Gall came up with this mapping of various properties inside our brains based on cadaver studies and then looking back at what the person was like historically. And it was the first attempt to kind of map function of the brain to, or map areas of the brain to cognitive function. And you may have seen cartoon takeoffs of this where a dog has a huge lobe for scratching and sniffing and rolling and bad stuff and whatnot. But this all stems from this fellow. Now, of course, we have our fantastic brain imaging techniques, and we are actually able to localize various functions. This is an image from the group at Irvine who studied PET and fMRI under anesthesia and awake patients and then sort of subtracted. And these are the areas they find that differ the most, thalamus and cortical projections, which goes with a lot of theories about thalamocortical projections being responsible for consciousness. But this raises a paradox because localization versus distribution. Stemming from phrenology, we know that, and now with a huge amount of evidence about focal deficits, specialized functions, hemispheric dominance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, specific functions are localized in specific regions of the brain. However, on the other hand, Carl Lashley, who set out as a localizationalist, if you will, trying to find the location of memory and other things, discovered that he couldn't and concluded that certain activities dependent on definite cortical areas can be carried out by any part, and that memory is distributed. It's all over the place. Now we know about neuroplasticity, global coherence, unity of self. Pribram proposed the holographic brain to explain this, and we have the binding problem of everything being bound together. So we have this paradox of localization versus distribution. We also have some other paradoxes, such as we know the brain utilizes both parallel and serial processing. And analogous to neural network computers, feedback versus feed-forward networks, hierarchical systems versus hierarchical systems, and bottom-up processes versus bottom-down processes, or top-down processing, excuse me. All of these things are going on in our brains. Now, a heterarchical versus hierarchical system might look something like this. This is from Crick and Koch, who have several interesting takes on the problem of consciousness. And it's a hierarchy, but with all this cross-connection, it's really what's called a heterarchy. And you can kind of summarize by saying everything seems to be connected to everything, almost. So it gets rather confusing. There must be some underlying order or principle, but nobody seems to know what. Well, how do we explain all this? There's a number of different approaches. Probably if you took a vote or a poll among scientists and philosophers worldwide, most would fall into A, which and I've merged actually several subvarieties: functionalism, computationalism, emergence. The basic idea is that the brain is a computer, that neurons and synapses act as bits or switches in a computer, and that through computational complexity and interactions among all these 10 to the 11th neurons, consciousness emerges as a novel property. Emergence is a term from nonlinear dynamics, which refers to the fact that you can get new properties in a hierarchy from fairly simple low-level interactions give rise to complex property. Wetness is an emergent property of individual water molecules. Weather storms, the great red spot of Jupiter, hurricanes and tornadoes are emergent properties of dust and air molecules interacting at a simple level. Candle flame is an emergent phenomenon. B would be dualism. Consciousness lies outside science, and there are many proponents of this. C stems from the Greek idea of panpsychism, that everything has some component of consciousness. Pan-protopsychism, pan-experientialism, or fundamentalism, if you'll pardon that pun, that consciousness or its precursors, proto-conscious precursors, are irreducible components of the universe, like mass, spin, or charge. They're just a given. They're just there. And we don't know why or how they got there, but they are. And somewhat related to this is the more spiritual ideas of the Buddhist universal mind, Jung's collective unconscious, Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere, David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist's implicate order, Penrose's Platonic realm, although he didn't mean it in a spiritual way. And there's some new ideas about quantum computation in the brain, which I'll get to later, and F, all of the above. And I personally think that all of these are valid, with the proviso that dualism refers to consciousness outside present science. We need to make some advances in terms of physics and biology. But what's wrong with the emergence idea? What's wrong with functionalism, computationalism, and emergence? First of all, there's no threshold for emergence nor testable predictions. If consciousness emerges at a critical level of computational complexity, there should be some equation, some formula, some idea of at what level consciousness will emerge, and there's none. Emergent phenomena abound in nature: weather patterns, candle flames, computer programs, yet they aren't conscious. Of course, I have to put a question mark there because I can't prove that they're not conscious. And I can't prove that you are conscious, and you can't prove that I'm conscious. Consciousness is unobservable. I'm not sure that's a good thing or not. It's a problem in anesthesia because we can't tell 100% that our patients are not conscious. So consciousness is unobservable, but presumably weather patterns and other emergent properties are not. These types of explanations, which are often AI hype, artificial intelligence hype, and AI people usually promise consciousness to government funding agencies to get another $100 billion worth of grants for the next 10 years so that we can have a conscious computer to run all our fancy military equipment and so forth. I'm being a little unfair, but not too bad. And others try to explain away or trivialize the problem. Dan Dennett's famous book, Consciousness Explained, was really a kind of a postmodern deconstruction of consciousness into little itty-bitty this and that don't amount to anything. Or they use bait and swap techniques. You'll read a paper, My Theory of Consciousness, this is how consciousness works, and you go through a whole long thing, and you find out at the end they're talking about reportability or memory or attention or something else, not really the hard problem. 4 is the fact that neurons and synapses are extremely complex, unlikely to function merely as single switches. For example, a single-cell organism like Paramecium can learn, avoid predators, find food, mates, and have a sex life without any synapses. It's just a single cell. So if a Paramecium can do that, surely neurons are at least equally complicated, I would hope.